wonder if you're a Jew. They're just people living in different conditions to you. They still die when you bomb their schools, mosques and hospitals. It's not because of rockets, please God, can you stop this all? I'm not related to the strangers on the TV, but I relate, cause those strangers could have been me. Words could never ever explain the raw tragedy. It's not a war, they're just murdering more rapidly, and we are automatically supporting pure savagery. Imagine how you feel if this was your family. Sing it with me now. Free, free Palestine. 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 Palestine remains in my heart forever. We stand for peace, times of war. We shan't surrender. Remember, it didn't start in this dark December. Every coin is a bullet if you're Marks and Spencer. And when you're sipping Coca-Cola, that's another pistol in the holster of them soulless soldiers. You say you know about the Zionist lobby, but you put money in their pocket when you're buying their coffee. Talking about revolution sitting in Starbucks. The fact is, that's the type of thinking I can't trust, let alone even start to respect. Before you talk, learn the meaning of that scarf on your neck. Forget Nestle. Obama promised Israel 30 billion over the next decade. They're trigger happy and they're crazy. Think about that when you're putting Huggies nappies on your baby. Sing it with me now. Free, free Palestine. 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 This is not just a war over stolen land. Why do you think little boys are throwing stones at tanks? And we'll never really know how many people are dead. They drop bombs on innocent girls while they sleep in their bed. Don't get offended by facts, just try and listen. Nothing is more anti-Semitic than Zionism, so please don't bring bad vibes when you speak to me. There's plenty of rabbis that agree with me. It's your choice what you do with this message, don't get it confused. I view this from a human perspective. How many more resolutions have to be violated? How many more children have to be annihilated? Israel is a terror state, they're terrorists that terrorize. I testify my television, televise, I'm telling lies. This is not a war, it is systematic genocide. But whatever they try, Palestine will never die. Sing it with me now. Free, free Palestine. 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 This is for Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for an answer. Wish I could take your tears and replace them with laughter. Long live Palestine, long live Gaza. Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for an answer. Wish I could take your tears and replace them with laughter. Long live Palestine, long live Gaza.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Assalamu alaikum to everyone tuning in. We're so excited to have you with us. My name is Isra Ibrahim, and I am an organizer with the South Florida Coalition for Palestine. First, I want to thank the organizations that are co-sponsoring and help to co-develop this webinar series. We have Al-Auda South Florida, which is a Palestinian organization that focuses on the right of return for Palestinians worldwide. We have SJP at Florida International University, an incredibly active, impressive student group in the social movement for Palestine. And we also have Hood Communist, which is a revolutionary African nationalist newsletter that I feel like a lot of us read. I know personally I do. That has produced some of the most impressive anti-colonial analyses by and for African people. And we also have the AAPRP, which is the All African People's Revolutionary Party, which is a Pan-Africanist organization that seeks the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism. And last but certainly not least, we have Black Alliance for Peace, a project that advances anti-war and anti-imperialist positions via the radical Black movement. Thank you so much to our incredible organizations that help to co-sponsor and co-develop this series, and everyone who is listening and watching in. So before I start our webinar series and introduce our panelists, I first want to provide the framework of why we developed this series. We recognize that Palestine, specifically the Islamic resistance in Gaza, is currently the vanguard of the world historical movement. It's the vanguard of anti-colonial struggle today. And with this, we recognize as organizations, as organizers worldwide within the diaspora and out, that there is a need for better understanding, for better theory, for better political analyses to ground and guide our organizing efforts, both locally and globally. We need to be able to continuously understand and heighten our understandings. We need to be able to understand and recognize the stage that our movement is at. We need to be able to recognize and deconstruct as well the reactionary ideas and politics that pull our movement down. If theory and analysis is what drives our organizing today, we have to continuously build on our theory and our analysis. So, with this in mind, we hope we can push for more organizers to have and maintain principled political frameworks to be able to drive their efforts, both here and abroad. So a couple of logistical notes for our participants. Any questions you have during or after this presentation, please utilize the Q&A function. We hope to be able to collect your questions at the end for our Q&A portion with our presenters. We are live streaming on the AAPRP YouTube and Facebook platforms. So please share with anyone who is interested and listening and watching in. Today's webinar specifically, we will be talking about settler colonialism and imperialism. We will be deconstructing how settler colonialism has emerged as a political structure and how it relates to today's current moment. So just to begin, we will be introducing our panelists. Today we have Nick Estes. Nick is an enrolled member of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe, an assistant professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota. He is a co-founder of the Indigenous Resistance Organization, the Red Nation, and lead editor of Red Media. In addition, we also have Onyesonwu Chatoyer, is an who is an organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party and the All African Women's Revolutionary Union, an editor with Hood Communist, and a member of the National Coordinating Committee for the Venceremos Brigade, which is the oldest Cuba Solidarity delegation in the US. Thank you so much to our presenters for being able to be here today, for giving us their time. And with that, I will give the floor to Nick.
Amatakiapi Nape Chuzapi Chante Washte. Thank you so much, Isra, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for the coalition for inviting me to speak today. I apologize. I had a PowerPoint presentation prepared, but there were some formatting issues. So I'm just going to be reading from the slides. Hopefully you don't get too disinterested and turned off. You'll just be hearing my monotone voice the entire time. But I'll talk a little bit about the Red Nation and the work that we do, as well as at Red Media, and why that connects with Palestine. So first of all, the Red Nation was founded in 2014. We in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in Dene and Pueblo territory. We began by addressing what we saw as border town violence. It's like vigilante or state violence against Native people in places that we consider border towns. And it's a very contentious term to say that, but it's a common term within indigenous communities in these regions. And typically we think of borders or border towns as those on this, the so-called US-Mexico border, or perhaps the northern Canadian-US border. But we think of border towns as those, white-dominated settlements that typically ring Indian reservations, where these sort of confrontations of sovereignty, of political legitimacy and authority kind of come to a head. And it comes to a head through the everyday criminalization of Native people and their presence on the land. And that's an incredibly important, topic, to an entry point into discussing the topic today, which is settler colonialism. But of course, as a nation, we weren't just focused specifically on police or state violence against Native people within these geographies of border town violence, but we looked at the sort of broader sort of imperialist scale of this violence and the project of the United States from the beginning of its foundation in 1776 and perhaps even before that to the present day. And why the United States is sort of has aligned itself with, historically with the sort of imperialist European powers, but now has become the global hegemon. And that actually begins here on this land. It doesn't begin, elsewhere in the world. Typically, we think of imperialism or settler colonialism according to really outmoded theories of, what they call the blue water thesis or the saltwater thesis, meaning that it can only be imperialism if somebody, typically a white European, travels across a body of water and colonizes a place, right? And we know that just simply isn't the case. First of all, geographically and territorially, that doesn't make sense, because Europe is a complete social construct. It's literally just Western Asia when you think about it. So how did it colonize parts of Asia? And then it's also, also still somewhat connected to the continent of Africa. So these things are just arbitrary, and they're social constructs made to sort of give us an idea of what is and what isn't imperialist and what is and what isn't settler colonial. So oftentimes, if the United States is talked about as possessing, colonial territories, it's typically we think of Puerto Rico or Hawaii or Guam or something along those lines. Typically island nations, right? Or there's a body of water separating them. But we don't think of settler colonialism, or we don't think of colonialism or imperialism as something that is continentally connected, right? Which I'll break it down a little bit later. But I just want to kind of throw that out there right away to think about how did the United States become, not only the global hegemon, but the main benefactor of the Israeli Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine. How did that happen? There are several sort of explanations for this. One is the sort of ideology, right, of manifest destiny, which I can talk about in a bit, and the concept of Zionism, right? It's important to point out that Christian Zionism actually preceded what we now know as the modern sort of Zionist movement. And in fact, there are more Christian Zionists in the United States than there are, Jewish Zionists proper. That's an important facet to point out, because it's typically non-Jewish people. There are more non-Jewish people in the United States that support the Zionist project than there are Jewish people. And it has to do with ideology. It has to do with geopolitics. And in the case of Christian Zionists, it's grounded in a sort of religious kind of a fundamental understanding of what the Holy Land is. But as we'll see in a bit, it ties into broader geopolitics. But before I continue, I just want to give out some resources, because you might fall asleep by the end of this talk. Hopefully you don't. But I just want to give out some resources that I recommend everyone read. There's a great website called decolonizedpalestine.com. It's a very useful toolbox. It's a 101 explanation of all the myths that Israel and its backers put out there in terms of, it's a anti-colonial movement. It's a Zionists are actually indigenous. Oh, I got some confetti. I don't know how that happened through scare quotes. Or that it's a conflict, or it's a conflict between nationalisms, like an Arab nationalism and a sort of Jewish nationalism. And they go through great pains at deconstructing and debunking these notions. The other resource that I would recommend is it's called Indigenous for Palestine.org. This was formed in collaboration with the Red Nation as well as other indigenous organizations. Initially started as a letter writing campaign to get tribal leaders and our leadership to acknowledge and to condemn Zionist aggression against Palestinians in sort of understanding our situations under settler colonialism as connected. But we over the time we've developed some blog posts, sort of connecting the current moment to a broader history of indigenous resistance, as well as some resources that are specifically about indigenous and Palestinian history. So I recommend checking those out. We have some wonderful YouTube interviews that you can access. We have the Red Nation podcast too, if you're not already a subscriber. Those are just some, shameless self-promotion. So just let's get into some definitional sort of terms, right? So I said several things like imperialism, settler colonialism. Those are some, $10 words, as my dad likes to say. But they're very important to understand. First of all, we didn't invent them. There's this kind of notion out there that like native people or left or the woke mob or the people that Zionists like to label as anti-Semitic, which are just people who are critical of the Zionist project. They like to say that we invented settler colonialism, which isn't true. It's actually settler colonialists invented that term, settler colonialism, and they called themselves settlers and colonialists and colonizers. It's just when it became out of vogue that they began to change the name and the nature, or tried to redefine the nature of their project. We can see that in the concept in the context of Israel, for example. The original founders, such as like Theodore Herzl or like Zionist thinkers such as Jabotinsky, actually called this a colonial project and referred to themselves as the future settlers of Palestine. And even they, people are like, oh, Palestine is an invented term, but they even use the term, Palestine. And I just want to read one quote to kind of give you an idea of how these early Zionist thinkers were thinking about Palestinians, indigeneity, and settler colonialism. And this is a quote from a 1923 article called "The Iron Wall" by Jabotinsky, who was a Russian Zionist. But he writes, every native population, civilized or not, notice the language, regards its lands as its national home, of which it is the sole master, and it wants to retain that mastery always. It will refuse to admit not only new masters, i.e. Zionists, even new partners or collaborators. This is equally true of the Arabs, i.e. the Palestinians. Our peacemongers are trying to persuade us that the Arabs are either fools who can deceive by masking our real aims, or they are corrupt and can be bribed to abandon us their claim to priority in Palestine. Notice the word Palestine, in return for cultural and economic advantages. I repudiate this conception of the Palestinian Arabs. Culturally, they are 500 years behind us. They have neither endurance nor our determination, but they are just as good psychologists as we are, and their minds have been sharpened, like ours, by centuries of spine-spun logometry. I don't even know what that term means. We may tell them whatever we like about the innocence of our aims, watering them down and sweetening them with honeyed words to make them palatable. But they know what we want, as well as we know what they do not want, right? Let me repeat that. They know what we want, the Zionists, as well as we know what they, the Palestinians, do not want. they feel at least the same instinctive jealous love of Palestine as the old Aztecs felt for ancient Mexico and their Sioux for their rolling hills, i.e., the Lakota, my people. So here, as we can see, Jabotinsky is positioning himself as the colonizer. He's positioning himself as the United States positioned itself against us, Lakota people, here. And I bring this up because it's directly justifying, on one hand, the United States' colonization and taking of native lands, but it's also situating Zionists as a European kind of formation into the role of colonizer and understanding that the what they call the Arab Palestinians are not going to be easily fooled by this sort of idea of treaty making like they did with us, that they know that we are coming to take their land, that they know that we are coming to remove them and to replace them. So this is an important sort of, letter just to kind of lay it out there. They're identifying explicitly a settler colonial project, that it's going to require not only the subjugation of Palestinians, but their removal and their concession to, by force, hence the name Iron Wall, that's the name of the essay, by force to the will of European colonizers, right? So that's settler colonialism in a nutshell. That is a far different project than what we typically understand and know as something called franchise colonialism, or perhaps, there's another version of colonialism called internal colonialism, and it's important to distinguish them from this version of colonialism, which is settler colonialism, because on one hand, internal colonialism, if we look at like in the Americas or in the Western Hemisphere, it's typically indigenous groups or nations are within those nation states. They're dominated, but they're not necessarily eliminated or removed. There are removal processes, right? There's racialization processes that take place, but it's not a kind of settler colonial kind of project the way that we're seeing with the United States and Israel. And that's, there's a lot of debate about that term, internal colonialism, but we can bracket that off to like a Q&A. And then the second version is franchise colonialism, which is like the traditional colonialism, right? It's the colonialism of the British and places like India, for example, where yes, the British ruled India and did awful things to, the subcontinent. There are many different, it's not just Indians. There are thousands of different ethnic groups, indigenous groups within what is now the kind of state of India, or the nation state of India. But this project that the British implemented within India was an extractive project, right? About extracting materials, extracting, the labor of the people, but it was never intended on replacing the indigenous population with British colonial and settler subjects. But it's not to say that, like, settler colonialism and franchise colonialism are different in violence. They're both incredibly violent, right? We can think about the mass starvation of people in India, at the turn of the 19th century, like tens of millions of people were starved to death, right? As a result of this kind of colonialism. Or we can look at, the Cote d'Ivoire or the Congo and think about the kind of franchise colonialism that was about literally extracting human bodies from Africa, and the immense amount of violence, death, and destruction. But it never created a sort of settler population to replace the indigenous African people. So those are important things to distinguish, not to say, like one is more inherently more violent than the other, or like one is, has some sort of unique there is a unique process, internal process, but it's part of the same sort of overarching structure of, specifically European imperialism. And I'll talk about that, in a little bit, but just to kind of go over some more examples. There's a post-colonial India, right? There are very few instances in which there's a post-colonial or post-settler colonialism. I think probably the one example that comes to mind, and I disagree with some of, and my mind has been changed on a lot of these things over time. There's really great theorists and thinkers and historians such as Joseph Massad, who've really challenged my conception of what settler colonialism is and how it occurs. But there's also, Robin D.G. Kelly has a response to the Australian scholar Patrick Wolf when he talks about just like kind of like the Anglo settler colonies of New Zealand, Australia, United States, Canada, etc., as being the only settler colonies. But we now know, I think, with a robust analysis of history, that South Africa was a settler colony, that Algeria was a settler colony of France. And we saw in the Algerian situation the process of decolonization, right? It was an attempt to subjugate and eliminate the native population, if not through outright annihilation, but through political and state-sanctioned violence to subjugate them. That decolonization process was incredibly violent. It was, millions, if not 10 million people died as a result of that very violent kind of struggle. And we see a similar kind of process unfolding in South Africa, where where the term apartheid was invented, right? And it's important to talk about what apartheid is because there's a UN definition of the crime of apartheid that was developed in the 1960s, I believe, by the anti-apartheid struggle. It's been applied not only to the South African situation, but it's also been applied to the Palestinian situation. But it's not entirely an accurate framing because it's a technology of settler colonialism. It's a technology of rule. It's a way of carving up a territory to concentrate people on land or Bantustans in the case of South Africa through a racial segregation process. We call that in the United States reservations, or in Canada, the reserve system, right? And these British, there was both kind of influenced by British colonial rule. They were talking to each other. They were saying, Bantustans are like the native reservations of the South, right? But while, the apartheid system was, in place, there was a distinct knowledge that the people were placed within these Bantustans were actually indigenous people, speaking indigenous language, speaking Swahili, speaking, Zulu, speaking all kinds of different indigenous languages. And some people, in very rare instances, got so comfortable, as we see oftentimes in reservation systems, with the kind of the territorial sort of rule of a government, some sort of self-autonomy, that they kind of naturalized those conditions, right? And the anti-apartheid movement was about denaturalizing that condition and saying that the white minority controls 70% of the land, 70%, therefore 70% of the resources, while the Black majority sits in destitute and is dispossessed from the land, right? And that's the other facet of settler colonialism, is that settler colonialism is fundamentally about land and territory. And while this is kind of signposting something I want to talk about at the end of this conversation. We talk about decolonization and what justice looks like in the context of settler colonialism. We often think, there's a very nice framing that, we have the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, applying pressure on apartheid South Africa to, end its apartheid colonial structure. But there was also an active armed resistance movement opposed to and it spilled into Rhodesia. It wasn't just something that was confined to South Africa, but it was a regional war. It was about decolonization and entailed more than just one country. Cuba sent They sent soldiers there, and in fact, if Cuba, at the request of the anti-apartheid struggle and the liberation movement, if they hadn't been there, they probably wouldn't have been as victorious in that particular struggle. There's a great, if you ever want to hear, it's something that hasn't been written about a lot. Cuba's sort of solidarity, like military solidarity, it's acknowledged, but there's a book. I think it's called Fidel Castro Speaks, and Fidel, talks a lot about that sort of, that history, and there were, the Cubans were actively engaged in armed struggle against, Rhodesian soldiers, but Israel was also a kind of a party to this struggle in keeping apartheid in place. Israel gave uh, South Africa the nuclear bomb, right? It made it a nuclear power, and this idea that once we install a nuclear arsenal into South Africa, it will make the racial white supremacist apartheid regime permanent. It will make settler colonialism permanent, right? And if we think about even somebody like Nelson Mandela, a lot of people don't know why Nelson Mandela was in prison for such a long time. It was because he refused to renounce armed resistance as a legitimate form of struggle and self-defense. Period. That's why he was in prison. And a lot of people kind of, whitewash, that's not a metaphor, whitewash that history. And that he was also a steadfast supporter of Palestinian resistance. And that's important to remember. It was because of the so-called civil society pressures, the nonviolent boycotts and protests, union organization and mobilization combined with a popular struggle against the apartheid regime. That's what brought it down, right? It wasn't just hugging the murder out of colonizers, as often we are implored to do while they shoot us dead, right? In our homes, in our streets, and in our own homelands, right? So I think that's an important aspect to remember. Um, Belle, I just want to do a time check. How much time do I have left?
21 minutes.
How many minutes? 21? Okay. So the next section I want to move into is talking about imperialism, and Zionism and manifest destiny, right? The United States was literally a small when it declared its so-called independence from Britain. It was small 13 colonies hugging, right, the eastern seaboard, which over the course of a century rapidly expanded to annex billions of acres of land and territory, right? That Oftentimes that violence of expansion was tied into the expansion of chattel slavery, the enslavement of African peoples, as well as the genocide of indigenous peoples, right? And this is an important turning point in not just the history of North America, but global capitalism as we know it. We have an army of free laborers who are laboring for free on the land, and we have quote unquote free land taken from people who are being eliminated and destroyed, right? But typically, when we talk about settler colonialism, we don't think of that as imperialism. But the annexation of territory and land is a form of imperialism. If you look at a map of the United States, you will see every single state was carved out of indigenous territory in a negotiated settlement about whether or not it was going to be a so-called free state or a slave state, right? So westward expansion, even in the political context of formations of states, was fundamentally about expanding on one hand, the institution of chattel slavery, as well as the genocide and removal of indigenous peoples. This happened through treaties. These treaties weren't just like, it wasn't this like a mutual coming together of people. There was one side that had a clear intent to take the land, right? And it happened basically through trick or treaty, in the sense that if you do not sign this treaty, we will wage endless war upon you, right? And this was guaranteed in the very founding document of the United States, which is the Declaration of Independence. Read it, please, because the 23rd complaint that the American colonists filed against the King of England said that, the merciless Indian savages who inhabit our frontier, whose only known rule of warfare is the destruction of any age of person, any sex, man, woman, or child, right? In other words, they're waging a savage war on us. That was pure projection. It was a way to dehumanize Native people in the first instance, to make their resistance appear as something that goes beyond what we understand the normal rules of warfare, therefore subjecting not just Native soldiers, Native warriors for elimination and target, but also subjugating women, children, people who are considered quote unquote non-combatants or civilians, right? That the entire destruction of indigenous peoples was guaranteed as a form of self-defense. The first rule of settler colonialism is to make invasion look like self-defense. Watch any Western movie, watch any US military movie that came out during the War on Terror or before, and they make the cowboy, the American soldier, an invader to a land who is surrounded by Native people, and he has to kill all these Native people in order to defend his territory, right? Which he invaded and stole. That's that is the United States is just one bad Western movie, right? When you really think about it. And in that, in that case, I guess like the state of Israel is just an even worse Western movie, like when you think about it. But I think that's an important sort of cultural phenomenon to point out, and how manifest destiny sort of ingrains itself within the everyday culture of settlers themselves, because it's not just a political ideology, it's a cultural ideology. It is the status quo of a society, right? So when we say things like land back, when we advocate for the return of land that was rightfully taken from us, and you hear African revolutionaries say this all the time: we will pay you for the land what your ancestors paid us for the land, because that is justice. And then you hear all these white people freaking out in Africa being like, white genocide, right? Because they know that they took the land, they didn't pay anything for the land, right? And they had to, in fact, they had to enslave and genocide people, just as they did to people here in the United States. So when they think of justice, when we advocate for our fundamental right to exist and to have access to our territory, which is actually upheld by the laws of the colonizer to begin with, that it becomes, oh, they're going to do to us what we did to them, because the settler colonial mentality is a zero-sum game. There can be no alternative other than the settler state. Period. That's the reality. So whenever Native people in the United States advocate for land back, we don't constitute a majority of the population of the United States. We don't present a military threat to the United States, but nonetheless, when we engage in nonviolent resistance, even to that extent, to protect our water from the expansion of oil pipelines across our lands, we are criminalized. We are called terrorists. Much in the same vein and spirit are the founding fathers who called us merciless Indian savages, right? And that's an important fact to remember, right? It's an important fact to also understand that with the kind of barbarity and the brutality in which the United States destroys or attempts to destroy indigenous nations and subjugate us, to take our land, to criminalize us. This isn't something that happened in the 19th century. It happened during the 1970s, the formation of the American Indian movement and the Red Power movement. The FBI deployed, its goons to essentially destroy that movement, to destroy it from the inside, to the point that we have in southern Florida, not in southern Florida, but in Florida, the known political prisoner of Leonard Peltier. He's the longest serving indigenous political prisoner in the United States. Why? Because his co-defendants in a case were let off, declared not guilty by reason of self-defense for shooting and killing two FBI agents who came onto land, opened fire, gunfight ensued, and his co-defendants were acting in self-defense, but Leonard Peltier was tried separately and found guilty for a crime he claims he never committed, right? But it wasn't just about adjudicating that sort of criminal act. It was about punishing the Red Power movement, the indigenous movement for liberation, and to capture it, right? To basically subjugate it and to destroy it, right? So when we think about imperialism, it's not just the expansion of this kind of economic system to take resources. It's also about destroying any alternative that arises to challenge its hegemony. Why invade Vietnam, which was largely a peasant country at that particular in time? Because of the spread of communism, right? Because of the spread of an alternative to capitalism. That's what we're also seeing in the context of Palestine. When after the Nakba in 1948, the state of Israel wasn't really, it was on the radar of the United States, but it wasn't really on the radar of the United States. It was, the United States was kind of lukewarm when it came to Israel. Sure, it supported the project, this and that, but it wasn't until 1967 that when Israel, the war in 1967, that Israel proved itself in the eyes of the United States as a legitimate military presence in the Middle East to destroy, to break apart, and to finish dividing up and subjugating these, newly kind of arising Arab Muslim nations within the Middle East to bend towards the will of the United States. Joe Biden has said, before he became president, that if Israel didn't exist, we would invent it. He didn't mean it in the terms of like an apology for a European apology for what Europeans did to Jewish people and their long, violent, genocidal history against Jewish people in Europe. No, he meant it as a military base, that Israel would be the projection of power of the United States within the region. It would destabilize. It would break the sort of solidarity between these Arab nations who had resources that the United States, wanted to maintain access to, right? So it had to destroy political alternatives that were arising within it, the non-aligned movement, the decolonization movement, the Arab national movements, right, that were coming through. So the reason why when we talk about settler colonialism, it's not just a kind of land-based project within a territory of Palestine, which is not very much larger than the state of New Jersey, right? This is a small territory, but yet it has captured the imagination of both the imperialist and those struggling to get free. Such a tiny, tiny place has such a major, impact on world politics and geopolitics and the shifts that are happening and the struggles to get free. Such a tiny nation has such a big heart for the rest of the world, right? That we as indigenous people here, it's bleeding, we can see it, but it's beating strong, and it's beating strong not just because of our solidarity and our good wishes and us taking to the streets, but because there's active resistance, right? It's the only way that they're going to survive this genocidal onslaught. And they don't want us to think of them, if they do want us to think of them, they don't want us to think of them but anything beyond just being a victim, right? But they are agents, just like we were agents in our time period. We were agents and makers of our own history, and that's what they're trying to recapture. They're trying to put them back into bondage and say, no, you will not be your agent of own history. You can only be a terrorist, or you can only be dead, right? Those are the only two options that they provide, not only for people who decide that they don't want to buy what the United States is selling, but they also say that to the people whose very existence is dependent on them, standing up to the colonizer. And so I'm out of time, but I think this is the kind of crux of the issue in this particular moment. And the reason, when we think about settler colonialism, there's often this other kind of framing to think about, well, it's the breakaway from a mother country. But I would say that Israel, like the United States, has never fully broken away from its European parents. It is both are fundamentally European projects. And we can't look, we can't look to the imperialist kind of alternatives that have been provided to us, which are destroying the planet. They're holding the world hostage. We can't have any other economic, social alternative. So that cannot be the path that we take. Europe must pay for Europe's crimes, but it is not incumbent upon us to adopt those as our sort of principles and our understanding of what it means to not only be human, but what it means to be free and to advocate for freedom. And so when we think about this in this context, the Israel can only exist through its primary benefactor, its mother country, the United States and Europe, right? Much as when the United States declared its so-called independence and led its counter-revolutionary war against us and our Black relatives, it benefited Europe. It raised the standard of living in Europe. Those trade goods went there, much in the same way that the continued projection of US power in that region benefits the ruling class here in the United States and in Europe. So I'll just end it there. And thanks so much for listening.
All right. Thank you so much to Nick for that incredibly comprehensive. I was not bored. I was riveted even without the slides. So deeply appreciate you, comrade, for sharing so much knowledge with us and really grounding us in exactly what settler colonialism is and exactly what Zionism is. So Isra gave me an intro at the top of the webinar, but you might have forgotten. So just to refresh your memory, my name is Onyesonwu Chatoyer. I am an organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party and the All African Women's Revolutionary Union. The APRP is one of the organizers of this event. We are a revolutionary Pan-African socialist political party. We have been an anti-Zionist movement, our organization, since our inception, and we are part of the worldwide anti-Zionist movement as well as the worldwide Pan-African movement. And what I'd like to talk about today, and I do have some slides. I love a slideshow, so I'm going to put them up on the screen. And what I'd like to talk about today is to reiterate what Nick just broke down to us so clearly, and to contextualize the Zionist project, the settler colonial project of Israel, the settler colonial project of the US empire within the larger global context of settler colonialism by doing some comparing and contrasting. And then I'm going to wrap it up by talking about the necessity of resistance to imperialism and settler-colonialism and why we must politically, materially support it. So I want to start with a quote from a book that is quite controversial in settler states for reasons that are obvious when you read it. The book is called Settlers. It was written by a man named Jay Sakai. And the whole book is available for free online, and I'll drop the link in the chat. I'm like doing double presenter tech duty, so I can't drop the link now, but I will drop it before the end of the webinar. So he says, capitalism needed giant armies of settlers, waves and waves of new European shock troops to help conquer and hold new territory, to develop it for the bourgeoisie, and to garrison it against the oppressed. And what the book Settlers is talking about is the specific settler colonial history of the United States. It makes a strong argument that settler colonialism in the US context was a cross-class project, meaning that the European ruling class and the European working class formed a temporary alliance to dispossess and commit genocide against indigenous peoples, to enslave African peoples, and to place the seeds that grew into the US empire. And so what he's saying in this quote is that settler colonialism is essentially a tactic of capitalism. Capitalism uses settler colonialism to acquire new territories, acquire new markets, engage in primitive accumulation, and settlers, whether they be working class, petty B, ruling class, etc., are engaged collectively in that project. So Zionism, point blank period, is settler colonialism. A lot of time and energy is invested by the ruling class, by the Zionist movement, by global imperialism to confuse folks about this basic fact. But like Nick laid out, Zionism, just like US nationalism, was white supremacist and imperialist from its inception. It is not an ancient religious struggle. It is not an indigenous liberation movement. It is not any kind of liberation movement. It has from its very inception been white supremacist, a tactic of Western imperialism, and aligned with Western imperialism globally. And Israel is very, very clear about this. This is part of the reason why the US provides undying support to Israel, and it's part of the reason why Israel conceptualizes itself as a bastion of so-called Western democracy in the Middle East. From the very beginning, Zionism was about stealing land, was about stealing resources, it was about extending the influence of Western imperialism to new territories at the expense of the indigenous population, the Palestinians. It has always been right-wing, even if sometimes people are like, I'm a liberal Zionist. I support Palestine liberation. I'm not giving the land back, though. It's still the same thing. It's still white supremacist. It's still imperialist. It's still settler-colonialism. And to understand this clearly, it's useful to compare and contrast the Israeli project of Zionism to other settler colonial projects that have happened across the world throughout history. So I want to start by talking about Zimbabwe. Much of the African continent, particularly Southern Africa, experienced the strategy of settler colonialism. European settlers coming to the shores of Africa, engaging in projects of genocide against Africans, and trying to set up basically European republics, European democracies on stolen African land. Zimbabwe was formerly known as Rhodesia when it was occupied by British imperialism. The African people in Zimbabwe endured several hundred years of colonization by the British until they rose up in a national liberation struggle that was victorious in 1979. The African people of Zimbabwe then went on to engage in a program known as the Land Reform Program, which is essentially them taking their land back. And in response, British imperialism, US imperialism, as well as the United Nations, which was dominated by imperialist countries, responded by sanctioning Zimbabwe. So if you've heard about any of this history at all, you probably knew about Rhodesia, you probably knew about British settler colonialism in Zimbabwe, and you probably heard about the Land Reform Program and heard it was a failure, that it destroyed Zimbabwe's economy because somehow African people had forgotten how to take care of our own land. But that is not actually what happened. The Land Reform Program was successful, and the Land Reform Program has to be replicated across settler colonies all over this world. We have to take the land back. Indigenous peoples, whether they are Africans or Palestinians or indigenous nations in the Western Hemisphere, are the best stewards of their own land. So don't believe the hype. It wasn't land reform that destroyed Zimbabwe's economy. It was economic sanctions applied by the entities that stole their land in the first place as revenge for taking their land back. In terms of how that land was stolen in Zimbabwe, we see similar strategies across contexts. The people carrying out might differ. The technology of how the strategy is carried out might differ, but the strategies are pretty similar. They engage in acts of irregular warfare, meaning warfare that specifically targeted civilians and civilian infrastructure. I'm talking about women and children, elders, disabled people. I'm talking about going for the water supply. I'm talking about salting the earth so that Africans in Zimbabwe could not grow food. And if this reminds you of tactics that Israel is currently carrying out in occupied Palestine, like restricting access to food and water, like destroying the land that Palestinians need to sustain themselves, that is because it is the same process. It is settler colonialism carried out by different forces with shared strategies. Other examples of how the process of settler colonialism unfolded in Zimbabwe include what I refer to as legal trickery, meaning that the British would sign treaties with the Africans in Zimbabwe and say, okay, you get this little bit of land and we get this, and then they would go back on those treaties. And that is what settler colonizers be doing. They did it in the Western Hemisphere, they did it in Palestine, they do it all over the world. They use their own legal framework to buy themselves time, to pretend that they are interested in coexisting, and then they completely abandon whatever agreement they make as soon as it is in their interest to do so, because the ultimate objective is always to completely dispossess the indigenous people, to destroy their culture, to steal their land, to commit genocide against them, and to forcibly assimilate the minority that remain. The other thing that we see in Zimbabwe when it was known as Rhodesia, actually, I hear someone off mute, and I'm just going to go ahead and fix that. Thank you. The other thing about Zimbabwe, when it was known as Rhodesia, when it was under British imperialist control, is we saw Rhodesia engaging in reactionary internationalism with other settler states. They had close relationships with the US government. They had close relationships with apartheid South Africa. They engaged in strategies of solidarity where they were like spying on each other's resistance movements, where they were engaging in weapons deals, where they were sharing tactics of repression. Throughout history, across settler colonial states, you see these states, whether it's Rhodesia, whether it's the US, whether it's Israel, sharing strategies across borders for how to best repress their indigenous populations, for how to best engage in land theft and resource extraction. And this is going to come up again. So, and the other thing about Rhodesia is that as anti-colonial movements were popping off across the African continent, the settler government in Rhodesia was extremely interested in engaging in strategies of counter-revolution. They were a force of reaction against African liberation movements carried out by Africans. And again, they did that in solidarity with the US, with apartheid South Africa, and with other reactionary settler states. And the picture on the slide is just, I feel like it's a really good illustration of what I'm talking about settler colonialism being a cross-class project, about the settler working class and the ruling class coming together with a temporary alliance to dispossess indigenous people. Like this is a mom and her child, and it would be like it would be like someone's like family photo, if not for the fact that she was holding a gun because she was a settler in Rhodesia. Next example, and Nick already went into this deeply, so I'm just going to briefly touch on it. It's really important to understand that when we talk about Zionism being a settler colonial project that must be opposed, we have to understand that the US is also a settler colonial project that must be opposed. The only way that the US empire came into being was with the mass dispossession and attempted genocide against indigenous people, the enslavement of African people, and imperialism that began in US territory and expanded throughout the Western Hemisphere and the world. From its inception, the United States of America has been an imperialist and white supremacist project from the beginning. And so if we're saying that we must oppose Zionism, if we're saying that we must stand for Palestinian national liberation because we oppose settler colonialism, then we have to reckon with what it means to live in the belly of the beast, to live in the most powerful settler state on the planet that is propping up all of the other ones. You cannot oppose Zionism without also opposing US imperialism and the US settler state. Indigenous people are still here. The United States and the entire Western Hemisphere is still their land, period. And the tactics that the settler colonizers in the US and throughout the Western Hemisphere used to steal indigenous land, again, mirrors how it unfolded in Zimbabwe, how it unfolded in Palestine, how it unfolded in Algeria and in settler states, settler colonies all over the world. Again, those tactics of irregular warfare, specifically targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. I'm talking about water supplies. I'm talking about food supplies. I'm talking about salting the earth so nothing can grow. I'm talking about signing treaties and then completely ignoring them. I'm talking about engaging in practices of forced assimilation, like residential schools. These are shared tactics of settler colonialism globally, and the US was no exception. And then another example, which is little discussed because this population has been forcibly assimilated into US American identity, but one of the earliest targets of British imperialism was in fact Irish people. Irish land was stolen and is still currently stolen by Britain. It was one of the first nations ever to be colonized by the British Empire. And these are European people. These are people who are racialized as white, who are still subjected to this process of land theft, of resource theft, of racialization, of dehumanization. They saw the same strategies of regular warfare, of again targeting food supplies, water supplies. They saw long-term military occupation that is ongoing on their own land. They see their population being racialized and criminalized by their occupiers. And the example of Ireland, whose national liberation struggle is still ongoing and what should be part of the conversation about global resistance to settler colonialism, really shows you how imperialism can racialize and dehumanize anyone. The point is to steal the land. The point is to steal the resources. If they want your land, it doesn't actually matter what you look like. They will racialize you too and take it. So I want to bring it back to Israel. We talked about what settler colonialism looks like and the shared tactics across contexts, whether it's Zimbabwe, whether it's Turtle Island, whether it's Ireland. So let's bring it back to occupied Palestine and make it really, really clear what it is we're dealing with. So Theodor Herzl, as Nick mentioned, is one of the ideological forefathers of the Zionist movement. He wrote this book, The Jewish State, which is actually not that long a read, and which I highly recommend to understand the political foundations of Zionism and the imperialist foundations of Zionism. So this is Theodor Herzl in a letter to Cecil Rhodes. And Cecil Rhodes was one of the main architects of settler colonialism in South Africa. So this is what Theodor Herzl was saying to Cecil Rhodes. He says, "You are the only man who can help me now. It is a big, some say, too big thing. To me, it does not seem too big for Cecil Rhodes. You're being invited to help make history. That cannot frighten you, nor will you laugh at it. It is not in your accustomed line. It doesn't involve Africa, but a piece of Asia Minor, not Englishmen, but Jews. But had this been on your path, you would have done it by now. How, then, do I happen to turn to you, since this is an out-of-the-way matter for you? How indeed? Because it is something colonial." And the context of this excerpt, what is Theodor Herzl doing in this letter? He's basically writing to Cecil Rhodes and being like, I see what you've done in South Africa. I'd like to do it in Palestine. What are some of the strategies you use? What is the best way for us to do it here? This is Theodor Herzl clearly conceptualizing the expansion of Zionism into Palestinian territory as an explicitly colonial movement, expanding Western influence into Asia the same way that Cecil Rhodes and his cohorts did into Africa. And so again, the media, the ruling class, the Zionist movement works very, very, very hard to confuse people about what Zionism is, to conflate Judaism and the Zionist movement. But it is very, very clear, even to the founders of Zionism, that Zionism has always been about imperialism, specifically Western imperialism. It has always been about settler colonialism. It has always been about white supremacy. It is an insult to Judaism and Jewish people to conflate Zionism and that religion. Zionists don't even do it except to be extremely cynical and cover themselves from criticism. All right, so continuing the conversation about Zionism in Palestine and around the world, like I said, settler states have each other's back. There is reactionary international solidarity between settler states all over the world. Israel itself is an outpost of US-led Western imperialism in the Middle East, and there is a reason why the US has always had Israel's back. We have been in the streets by the thousands, the hundreds of thousands, all over all the world, from Ghana to Orlando to London, all over this planet. Thousands of people are in the streets saying, ceasefire now, saying Israel must stop. And the US ruling class, the Western ruling class, says, hell no. As a matter of fact, the Biden administration has 2 times now bypassed congressional approval in order to send billions of dollars in weapons to Israel to continue Israel's genocide of Palestinians. The Biden administration has outright refused to seriously consider a ceasefire, and they have instead engaged in demonization of Palestinian solidarity organizing. And the reason for this is because the US very, very clearly understands that Israel is key to Western imperialist strategy in the Middle East. Just as Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa were key to Western imperialist strategy in Africa. That is the reason why, when the whole world was boycotting apartheid South Africa, the Reagan administration was sending them weapons. This is the reason why, when the whole world was standing in solidarity with Ireland's national liberation struggle, the US was working overtime to demonize the Irish resistance as terrorists. There has always been solidarity with Western settler colonial states all over this planet, and that is because they have shared interests of violence and domination. Another really clear example of the reactionary solidarity between the US and Israel as Western imperialist outposts, as settler states, is what's known as the deadly exchange. And that is the practice of US police forces traveling to Israel to learn better tactics of violence and repression to use against us, particularly movements for social justice in the US, particularly African and indigenous colonized people in the US. And Israel doesn't just share strategies of repression with US police forces. Israel also exports strategies of repression all over the world, in Africa, in Central and South America, and in the Caribbean. For example, in Haiti, and there's a very good article on Hood Communist that talks in more detail about this that I'll put in the chat. But in Haiti, Israel has trained Haitian police forces that then go on to violently repress Haitian people protesting against US imperialism. In the Congo, Israel is looting Congolese resources and also, again, training Congolese security forces to brutally repress Congolese civilians. In Latin America, in Central and South America, Israel has repeatedly backed far right-wing fascist governments, provided them with weapons, with training, with political support to again repress indigenous peoples' movements and social justice movements. So it's not just Palestinians that the US is helping Israel repress, it's colonized peoples all over this planet. Israel aligns with global imperialism all over the world, which is again a clear indication that Zionism is nothing more but a white supremacist, imperialist, settler-colonial project that must be opposed. So let's bring it all together by talking about what the consequences of global colonialism, global settler colonialism, and imperialism are, what it looks like. It is important to understand that the reason why the US, why Europe, why Israel are wealthy so-called first world countries is because of it's a direct product of the underdevelopment of Africa, the Americas, and Asia. And what that means is that the US, Europe, and Israel are wealthy because the rest of the planet is poor. The only reason why a so-called first world exists is because global capitalism and imperialism rest on a foundation of resources, land, labor stolen from the majority of the planet's population. That is the only reason why there is a first world and a third world, why there's a global north and a global south. It is a giant pile of stolen wealth and bodies. So we are living in a reality of Western imperialist domination led by the US empire. And that reality includes global inequality because of those resources and land and labor stolen. It also means the violent erasure, co-option, and destruction of indigenous and colonized peoples' cultures globally. Like we are taught as African people, for example, that we are somehow less than European people. If we are Palestinian people, we are taught that our resistance is inherently terroristic, that we have no right to our land, that we are usurpers on someone else's land. If we are indigenous people, we have to deal with being erased from the discourse, living in conditions on a fraction of our own land, in very underdeveloped conditions. We have to deal with people claiming themselves to be indigenous when their ancestors engaged in projects of indigenous genocide. We also see globally the dehumanization, racialization, and criminalization of indigenous and colonized peoples, and particularly our resistance. If we are an African person fighting for African liberation, if you're a Palestinian person fighting for Palestinian liberation, if you're an Irish person fighting for Irish liberation, chances are at some point in your journey, you are going to be accused of terrorism. You might even be charged with terrorism and locked up for life. And the reason for that is that the vast violence against us forms the foundation of the global Western imperialist project, and our resistance to that project is an existential threat. And so it will always be criminalized, it will always be demonized, and it will always be, they will attempt to stamp it out at any cost. This is why we are the terrorists. This is why our resistance is framed as unacceptably violent. This is why they focus so much time on trying to get us to condemn our own resistance, to condemn ourselves, because it is an existential threat to their domination that is destroying this planet and which has destroyed our nations. So some of the strategies of domination ongoing in the world today look like land and resource theft that is leading to the total destruction of the planet that we all need to live. It is the capitalist imperialist system that is leading to the devastating impacts of climate change that we are all suffering through, and that indigenous and colonized peoples are on the front line on. This is a tactic of Western imperialist domination. Another tactic of Western imperialist domination that is actually one of the most common tactics is what's known as economic warfare. So like the US blockade on Cuba, the Israeli blockade of Zion on Palestine that doesn't allow food and water in and out, economic sanctions placed on countries that are resisting imperialism, like Venezuela, like the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, like Iran. Those are examples of strategies of Western imperialist domination meant to put down resistance. And also debt traps, like International Monetary Fund, structural adjustment programs that force countries to destroy their safety nets, that force countries to privatize their resources so that Western corporations can have access to them. All of these are tactics of economic warfare. Another strategy of domination is puppet governments and captured militaries. This is particularly the case in the African continent, although it happens everywhere. There are 54 or 55 African nations have a military agreement with NATO or the US military through AFRICOM. There's only one independent military in Africa, that's the Eritrean military. All the rest of the militaries have military agreements and direct training and weapons from the US and from NATO countries. And the consequence of that is that when African people engage in organized resistance against resource theft, against land theft, against the exploitation of our labor and resources by Western imperialism, including Israel, our militaries and police forces turn their weapons on African people, not against the people stealing our land, not against the forces exploiting us and oppressing us, but against the African people that are fighting back. And the reason for that is because of these puppet governments who are beholden to imperialist states like the US, like Israel, like Europe, and whose militaries who are beholden, again, to these imperialist powers and not to African people. Another major strategy of domination that we see, particularly through the media, but also through rhetoric coming from our Western governments, is the demonization of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist resistance. If you are a person who's been engaged in any kind of Palestine solidarity organizing since October 7th, then I am quite sure that at some point you've been asked to condemn Hamas and or condemn anti-Semitism before you say that you oppose genocide in Palestine. And despite the fact that there is nothing that Hamas could do that could equal the violence, the ongoing violence of the Zionist occupation of Palestine and the ongoing violence of Western imperialism, we are expected as a liberation struggle, as a resistance movement, as people in solidarity with those movements, to condemn our own resistance as a prerequisite to be including in conversations of solidarity in the West. That is a rigged game. There is no point whatsoever in condemning any kind of form of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist resistance. The violence of people resisting colonization and imperialism could never, in any reality, be equal to the violence of imperialism and settler-colonialism. It could never. And it is a rigged game to even attempt to play into that, to even attempt to give them what they're asking for, because the ultimate goal of asking us to condemn that resistance is for us to turn our backs on it entirely. So don't even participate. And then the last thing that I want to say, that's going to lead me into the closing part of this section, is that it's really important to understand that Israeli identity, US American identity, and Western identity as a whole is deeply tied to these histories and strategies of domination. You can't actually separate it. The understanding of what it means to be a US American, what it means to be an Israeli citizen, what it meant to be a citizen of Rhodesia, a French citizen of Algeria, is intrinsically tied to the violence of the settler colonial and imperialist project. They cannot be separated. The entire idea that the so-called Western world is more developed and advanced and somehow morally correct than the majority of the world's population is an example of what I mean. There is a inherent belief in the superiority of these colonizing imperialist nations that trickles down into all aspects of their nationalism, all aspects of their identities, and they cannot be separated. We as people fighting in social justice movements in the belly of the beast have to reckon with this, have to understand what it means, and have to find identities that are separated from that legacy of domination. That is why we call ourselves African people, for example. And just to make it really plain, when we talk about Western identity, when we talk about American identity, rather US American identity, and we talk about Israeli identity, we are talking about identities rooted in white supremacy. Western identity equals white supremacy. You cannot separate them. You cannot separate US American identity from the project of imperialism and settler-colonialism and white supremacy that the US was birthed from. You cannot separate Israeli national identity from the project of Zionism. From the very beginning, they were stealing land, stealing resources, committing genocide against Palestinians in occupied Palestine and against indigenous people in the United States. There is no separating that reality from US American identity, from Israeli identity, and from Western identity. And I keep saying US American because this entire hemisphere, all of the Western hemisphere, is the Americas. But when we talk about American, for some reason, people automatically assume we mean US American. As an example of what I mean, the hegemony, the domination, the taking up of all the space in the discourse and the erasure of all the other stories and narratives and nations that exist. Like the reason why American meant one country, not even like the most populous country in the hemisphere, instead of the whole hemisphere, is because of Western imperialist domination, because of the US empire's hegemony in this hemisphere. And again, just want to reiterate, you cannot separate Western identity, Western chauvinism, and US American Israeli nationalism from white supremacy. It is built in at the root. I think Nick mentioned some concepts that folks should learn about, like manifest destiny, which was the idea that the genocide against indigenous people, the violent expansion of European settlers across the US was somehow ordained from God. The Monroe Doctrine, the idea, I believe I think it was Roosevelt, where the US had the right to define the governmental structure and future of the entire Western Hemisphere. The Nazi German idea of Lebensraum, which is very, very closely connected to the idea of manifest destiny, where they were talking about wiping out all of the so-called lesser races in Europe and stealing all of the land for the Übermensch, like the perfect German people. These are built in to Western identity, US American identity. And so Zionism as a political project comes from the very same roots. And we're going to have a webinar later in the series, I believe on the 30th, where we're going to talk about the political roots of the Zionist movement, the anti-Semitic roots of the Zionist movement. So I'll leave it there, but we're going to go more into that. And so just to wrap it up, we've talked in detail about the violence and repression of settler colonialism and what that looks like around the world. We've talked about how these settler projects share strategies, how they look similar all over the planet. And now it's important to recognize that any place in the world where you engage in violent repression of oppressed people is going to result in resistance from that people. Oppression breeds resistance always, always. And in fact, colonized people all over this planet, whether they're in Africa or Palestine or the Western Hemisphere or anywhere in this planet, have not just a right, but a duty to resist. We have the right to define our own destinies. We have a right to fight for our land and our identity and our culture. And when I say we have a duty to resist, I mean that the global capitalist imperialist system is destroying the planet that we need to live. It is destroying the water supplies. It is destroying the land. It is pushing us closer and closer to the brink of nuclear annihilation. Before we are annihilated by climate change, it is a death spiral for this planet and everybody on it. And Palestinian people, African people, indigenous peoples, colonized peoples all over this planet who are resisting imperialism are the front line of defense for all of us against this system that is destroying the planet that we need to live on. So we have a right to resist because we have a right to exist, but we also have a duty to resist unless we want to die because of what imperialism has done to the planet. It's also important to recognize that we do not have the right to define how any indigenous and colonized person can fight back, particularly not in the belly of the beast. Like, how are you gonna pay taxes to the government that has sent billions of dollars and weapons that are now raining down on Palestine and say, Palestinians, you can only fight back in the ways that I find acceptable? That is absurd. Our fight is with the Biden administration, with the Trump administration, with the US government that is providing political, military support to Israel. We do not have the right to tell Palestinians how to fight back, just as no Europeans have the right to tell African people how we should fight back. We don't have the right to tell indigenous people of the Americas how they should fight back. When Malcolm X said by any means necessary, he meant that all forms of resistance, including militant resistance, is justified in order to resist imperialism. And again, these anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggles are the front line of defense for all of us against a system that is destroying the planet. No matter what tactics of resistance that indigenous and colonized and oppressed peoples engage in, none of our resistance can ever be more violent than the structures and systems of settler-colonialism and imperialism. We must be focused on the mission. We must understand that if we believe in justice, our objective must be the total defeat of settler-colonialism around the world and the imperialist system globally. We have to destroy these structures that are destroying us, and we have to replace them with systems that are based on justice and life. And again, Palestinian people, indigenous people, African people, people resisting colonization and imperialism all over this planet are our front lines of defense in that struggle to build a new global order based on justice and life. So I just want to wrap up by talking briefly, and I know I have like 8 minutes, and I feel like I'm going to finish right on time. I feel it. So I just want to talk about some global resistance struggles that are happening right now. As I mentioned, the All African People's Revolutionary Party is part of the worldwide Pan-African movement, whose objective is the total liberation and unification of Africa under a socialist government. We are part of a global struggle to liberate Africa and African people worldwide. And one of the most exciting advancements in that struggle that's unfolding as we speak is what's known as the Alliance of Sahelian States, which includes Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, which in the past few years have successfully driven out French imperialism from their land, driven out French troops from their land, and now are now allying economically and politically, and who are talking about building a Pan-African movement in Africa. Another example is the Revolutionary Socialist Project of the Cuban Revolution, which has for more than 60 years defended itself successfully against continuous attacks by the US government. And also, just want to note, every single year in the United Nations General Assembly, the US blockade on Cuba is condemned by the majority of the world's population. And every single year, the only countries that vote not to condemn the blockade are the US and Israel, and any other client state that the US has on a string at the time. Like one time it was Colombia before the progressive government was elected. Another time it was Ukraine. That's another story. But US, Israel consistently vote against condemning the US blockade because settler states have each other's backs. And then, of course, the national liberation struggle currently unfolding in Palestine is a clear example of a resistance to imperialism, successful resistance to imperialism that is happening right now that must have our political and material support. Not just the uprising on October 7th, but also the fact that the Palestinian armed resistance right now is militarily defeating the Israeli military. That is why Israel is so focused on civilian targets, because they cannot make any substantive advancements against the Palestinian armed resistance, which is made up of many groups. So we must support global resistance to imperialism in Palestine, in Africa, in Cuba, in the Western Hemisphere. We must, as people in the belly of the beast, stand on the right side of history, stand with the global oppressed, rising up against imperialism and fighting for our future on this planet. So thank you so much.
Wow, wow, wow. That was incredible. I feel like I'm so sad that this is about to end because our panelists were just incredibly amazing. I think I speak for the most of us that we learned so much from the both of you. Thank you so, so, so much. We will be starting our Q&A portion right now. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A function. We'll go ahead and start. So one reoccurring question that we had before when people signed up and during our the presentation was regarding Indigenous solidarity. So it was a specific question about um, how do people, comrades of a non-Indigenous background, people from the Black Lives Matter movement, the liberation movement, who are building up solidarity with Palestine, how do we then build up that support for the Indigenous struggle here? And I think I'll just offer a little bit of my 2 cents. I think for a lot of us, organizers, activists within the Western Hemisphere, I think we do have to confront our positionality within the belly of the beast, that we have to understand what our complicity is on this land. And I think that's part of the reason why there is that kind of like disconnect. And just like our presenters mentioned, that when we say that we are against Zionism and settler colonialism, we have to take that to honestly its logical conclusion, which means, the settler state that we occupy here. So I want to pose that question to you guys. How can we, as organizers and activists in liberation movements in the Western Hemisphere, how do we drum up more support and more solidarity for Indigenous struggle, Indigenous movement here at home?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll just jump right in. Actually, this is a conversation that Onye and I used to have a long time ago when we both lived in Albuquerque. But I think it's important to remember that, when we have like the movements such as Stop Cop City, movements to stop, the Dakota Access Pipeline, that the settler state in its surveillance of Native people and Palestinians and African folks, it sees these movements as connected. It sees them as, the settler state and its oppression is intersectional. It doesn't want us to be united, but just out of spite of the settler state, that's not why we should unite. That's not why we have those conversations. And there are difficult conversations that need to be had. I don't think, for example, I don't buy into the argument that Native people in North America are somehow natural allies to Palestinians. We have to raise our level of consciousness to understand the system that oppresses us first and foremost, right? And that it doesn't, sure, settler colonialism is always about Native people, but it's not just about Native people. It's about our allies in struggle and how we want to build a new world, There's often this kind of really false backward notion to say that somehow the response to the white supremacist ethno-state is to build another ethno-state, and I think it's a projection on one hand, right? It's gonna, like, the whole idea that we're gonna do to them what they did to us in terms of like creating this exclusionary boundary or implement a kind of modern capitalist state. We have to begin to imagine and think about political formations that exist beyond, what is currently on offer in liberalism, specifically capitalist imperial liberalism. right? And I think there are examples, especially in this hemisphere, the project of plurinationalism, that you do not get, you do not center the individual, you center the collective, your national origin, that there can be political projects that are not just about individuals and individual rights, that protect private property, but are about sort of the collective benefit of groups of people, understanding that their peoplehood as distinct as, as cultures, but also understanding that our strength isn't our homogeneity. Our strength is our diversity and our, not the DEI version of diversity, but the diversity of who we are as human beings, and how we understand. When we talk about indigenous sovereignty, we're not invoking the Westphalian state model of sovereignty, which is premised on exclusion first and foremost. Indigenous people existed by the hundreds of nations, right? In relation with each other, and we didn't genocide each other, right? The modern state formation, as we understand it today, the nation state formation, is a relatively recent phenomenon. So too is capitalism and imperialism. It's not the natural state of things, right? And so when we talk about these alliances, we have to actually denaturalize the things that make us separate. And I think Onye has pointed out, racialization is one of the fundamental core features of capitalism, right? Why is it that certain regions of the world become sacrifice zones, become zones of profit making and extraction? Why isn't the child who's mining diamonds in Congo paid the same wage as a white person, a tech CEO, in Silicon Valley? It's because of racial capitalism. It's because of a capitalist world system that extracts value from one place and then tries to realize it in a different place. That's how the world is, that's how the world is shaped. And the only way that we get to a point where we understand that these unjust relations have to be undone is to understand the things that separate us, while also retaining and understanding our histories as distinct people are incredibly important and should thrive in be contributions to these moments, and whatever country that has yet to exist that we have to bring into existence, but also understanding that there are hundreds of peoples and nations that have existed before the United States, in spite of the United States, and after the United States. And I think that's, you can't be afraid to say that. There's a long, long history, that's being ignored. And I think, it's our task to build something collectively as many peoples, not just as, one kind of American people or whatever it is, but as many peoples. Like as the Zapatistas say, a world in which many worlds fit. And I think I very much buy into that idea.
No, thank you so much for that. I think it's also an aspect of the settler colonial project that it has this enduring effect where we think it's eternal, that when we live in a time or an age of empire, we think and believe that empire is eternal and always has been. But you understand that there's a beginning and end to these things, and that there is a historical curve and trajectory, and and that's why it's so important that we historicize and place ourselves accurately, within the moment, that we don't fall into, I think, what tends to happen, this kind of like demoralizing after effect. I think it's, at 2 months and more, after October 7th, and you start to see this kind of I would say, this kind of activist like kind of burnout because of this. And this is why we have to enhance and heighten our political consciousness, to like what you mentioned. So thank you so much for that. Anya, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think
Or
Nick really got it. Mic drop.
Awesome. So continuing on, so I think just gearing the questions a little bit to more about organizing efforts. So one question we got is, given the deep history of Zionism and the settler colonial project, and the American commitment to this, what do you think about Americans asking their politicians, representatives to call for ceasefire? How effective could the strategy be if Israel is and has been for decades an extension of the US empire? Are they peaceful tactics? Are these peaceful tactics a form of insanity? Doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting change. So what is your guys' response to this?
So a couple of things come up for me around this question, and specifically around the demand for a ceasefire. One is that there has to be, like, what's happening now, over 20,000 Palestinians killed from Israeli attacks since October is not a sustainable situation. That in order for Palestinians to fight, they need the space to do that. And the US is providing the weaponry, the US is providing the global political support, and we in the US have to organize and mobilize and demand that it stop. Having said that, it's also true that the reality situation is that the US depends on Israel for its strategy in the Middle East, and the rest of the world. That there is not going to be a point where the US stops backing Israel because it's the right thing to do. Like the Zionist project, the Israeli occupation is key to Western imperialism strategy. And so I think that we have to recognize the reality situation that it is very unlikely that we are going to get a meaningful response to the demands for a ceasefire. At best, we're probably going to get crumbs. And we also have to recognize that this moment of mass mobilization is an opportunity for deepening people's analysis of what's happening and why, for helping them understand. Like thousands and like 300,000 people marched in Washington, D.C. in November calling for a ceasefire. And the Biden administration said, nah, y'all are all terrorist anti-Semites. Biden's own staffers covered their faces and went in front of the White House and were like, ceasefire now. And he was like, shut up, how about a pizza party? Like, they are not going to give us a ceasefire because they need Israel in the Middle East. They don't care about Palestinian lives. And we have to, as organizers, help people understand why. We have to deepen the demand for a ceasefire to an ending of the Israeli occupation, to an ending of the Zionist project, but also to resistance against Western imperialism. People have to understand the connections, and this is our opportunity. When thousands of people, like I never thought I would see in my life, an anti-imperialist movement of this scope, this level of mass mobilization for something that's happening to people outside of the US. Because the US ruling class and media work very, very, very hard to keep people narrowly focused on what's happening in the US and to make them apathetic and ignorant about what's happening outside of the world. But in this moment, people are questioning what they are seeing. They are posing US imperialist interests, and is an opportunity for us in the global anti-imperialist movement and in our respective national liberation struggles to get them into deeper solidarity and into deeper, more organized action. So I think that we have to continue to mobilize and demand a ceasefire. And I also think that that action, that mobilization has to be broadened to resist Zionism, to resist settler-colonialism, to resist imperialism, and we can do it.
Awesome. Nick, anything to add to that?
No, Anya really kind of summed it up. I'll just add one thing because I think just to kind of build on what she said was, with boycott, divestment, and sanctions, people typically are like, well, what is boycotting? Is it really going to do anything? And it's like some people say, well, it's as good as saying, a land acknowledgement, but the difference between a land acknowledgement here in the United States, and I support it in some sense because you do need to acknowledge that we're still here, but it's an empty gesture because it doesn't actually change the socioeconomic reality. The settler state does it from a position of power, knowing that there's nothing that's going to change. But if you do that, what seems like symbolic gestures in the Palestinian situation actually delegitimizes the ongoing violence that Israel is perpetrating, its ongoing occupation, right? It delegitimizes that, and it does have a more of like a socioeconomic material impact on the ground because it relies on that legitimacy, that it relies on that cultural legitimacy within the eyes of the world. So I would say even if we cannot, bring our own, political ruling class to call for a ceasefire, here and there, city councils, whatever it is, representatives doing it is important, and doing it in mass, with there are people in the streets, there are millions of people in the streets who are saying this, and that's incredibly important. But it's, obviously, I think
Mhm.
majority of people who are in the streets are thinking beyond just what a ceasefire means. They're not just saying that this is something that can sustain itself because, well, what are the political solutions? Well, does it just
Mhm.
go back to the state of normal? Does it go back to slow genocide instead of like quick
Yeah.
genocide? So I think those are the questions that Onya kind of, really challenges us to think beyond just a kind of a band. It's, I'm not going to say it's a band-aid because it will save lives and it's important. We should be advocating for that. But it's a temporary. Is it going to be a temporary thing, or is it going to be result in the end? Are we going to actually take the boot off the neck? Or remove the knife from the back?
Mhm. I think what you just said really highlights again the necessary the need to have these kind of analyses and these kind of discussions because it is about um, understanding what are the logical conclusions of what we're asking for. What does it actually mean to oppose settler colonialism and take that actually to its logical conclusion? So as an organizer, I think that's a really helpful framework, or at least like even like a practical one to say, well, okay, well, this is a step, but then what comes after that? And then to understand that when we call for an immediate ceasefire, obviously it's like an end to the immediate genocidal violence we see unfolding. But after that, are we asking then for a return to the colonial order? And then what do we do about that? So these are really important questions to really consider and have us, challenge as organizers. Um, Another question, I guess, regarding organizing, there's been a lot of news and like a lot of media focused on the UN as a civil society formation and pressure on the UN and the role of the UN. What, if any, utility do you guys find in orienting around war crimes and more largely the UN as a formation, as like a moral metric for behavior and like even strategy for strategic action?
I think we should like completely set aside the
Hmm.
the moral metric piece, and just
Yeah.
focus on like the strategy piece because I think
Hmm.
that it's just I feel like the structure of morality that we under operate under is like a Western dominated one, and so you can like kill millions of people, but if you
Yeah.
like rock, then you're the wrong. It's just no. So, but I think with the strategy of like, for example, like South Africa recently brought a case against Israel for its genocide of Palestinians to the International Court of Justice. And
Hmm.
I think what we see, like the way that Israel responded, is instructive for understanding the utility of these strategies. Because as soon
Hmm.
as South Africa did that, Israel immediately starts attacking South Africa, attacking the entire process. Now we
Hmm.
understand, like the ICC, the ICJ, the United Nations, these bodies are dominated by Western imperialist states because Western imperialism dominates the world. And so most frequently we see global South nations getting any kind of accountability in these structures and Western imperialist nations getting away with murder, quite literally. But there is like a propaganda purpose and also like an organizing purpose for taking this kind of action. And I feel like you can see it in Israel's response. Like they are extremely invested in winning
Hmm.
the propaganda war and winning the
Yeah.
narrative war. And South Africa, by taking this action of taking Israel to the ICJ and explicitly naming what they're doing as genocide, is a direct blow in that propaganda war. And so I feel like that is the utility. Like right now, they are dominating the narrative. Right now in the US, the majority of the discourse is about how resistance to genocide is somehow equal or worse than genocide itself. How our
Hmm.
solidarity with Palestinian people is somehow intrinsically antagonistic to Jewish people. Like they have completely got us caught in the weeds talking about like the basic legitimacy of our solidarity. But by saying Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians, South Africa has cut through all of that and said, this is what's happening, this is wrong. And I think there is a very strong utility for that in terms of our
Hmm.
organizing globally.
Yeah, I'll just
Awesome.
add like a historical, anecdote. The League of Nations, which was this kind of post World War I formation that was supposed to, implement self-determination and be, prevent another world war, which is essentially just a European civil war, actually collapsed in the late 1930s over the question of Italy invading Ethiopia, because the League of Nations refused to condemn or take legal action against Italy, because it didn't see Ethiopia as civilized enough and advanced enough, right? We can see the same mentality with Palestine. It's barely recognized, they call it the state of Palestine, but is it a state? Does a state, it's completely controlled externally by, even the Palestinian Authority is controlled by Israel. But there's this kind of pantomiming of legitimacy, as Anya kind of pointed out, around Israel's continued occupation and existence on stolen land and amongst captured people who are literally imprisoned within an open air concentration camp. But yet we are supposed to believe that these kind of rules apply equally, right? The Universal Declaration on Human Rights, we know, isn't universal when it comes to the question of Palestine. And so I think it's going to be, I support the South African, a petition, and against the state of Israel for its for perpetrating genocide. But I don't have, like, again, it's when it comes to the question of Palestine, it's dominated by Western imperial interests. Look at the ICJ judges. They have to get 8 votes out of, I think it's like 16 or 15. I can't remember how many judges they have, but most of them are like aligned with the United States, right? Or aligned, have normalized relations with Israel. So I don't know. I'm not feeling confident that the ICJ is going to be a neutral arbiter when it comes to the question of Palestine and genocide. But the question should then frighten the rest of us, because if it's okay to live stream a genocide in front of the entire world, I can literally watch it on my phone. What else is it okay to do? It is like, as Gustavo Petro said, that this is going to be a global Nakba, right? Whether it comes to the genocide of Palestinians, or the genocide that's going to is resulting because of climate change, that is largely the responsibility of the northern imperialist powers, holding the rest of the world hostage, right? The last COP meeting, I can't remember which, I think it was COP 26, was it? Or I don't remember the number, but the entire COP meeting was dominated by the question of Palestine. Whether one state has the right to genocide another group of people. That was the question, and they couldn't resolve it. But people were walking out. But it shows there's a shift, and I think Onya, in her presentation, the concluding part of her presentation, has shown that people are delinking. Nations are delinking from this imperialist supply chain. They're delinking from the sort of political hegemony that the United States has perpetuated on the rest of the world, has Europe has perpetuated on the rest of the world. And so we're seeing new political things, projects emerge, but yet the United States still holds the veto power to deny the will of billions of people on the planet for a ceasefire, to deny the will, the right of Palestinians not to be genocided, to live as they should, right? They hold that bloody hand. Just think about it, that bloody hand that was raised twice, that could have ended all of this, was raised to continue to back this genocidal regime. If they're willing to walk into the inferno that Israel has created into Gaza, what else are they willing to walk us into and the rest of humanity into? So when the question of the United Nations comes up, It's important. I think it is a site of struggle. It's where some nations can only find a voice. It's important. I believe that we should have international cooperation. I'm not, some kind of narrow-minded person. These discussions need to happen, but I also don't have faith in Western imperial powers to
Yeah.
exert a shred of humanity when it comes to the question of Palestine or the global South.
No, thank you so much for that. I think it's really important we think through how we work within civil society institutions, within, different kind of strategies, again, to not just to call for an end of the genocide, but an end of, this parasitic kind of, settler state and relationship. I mean, and with that, I guess for organizers, one question that came up was, with the think globally and act locally mindset, what are some examples of providing both political and material support to global resistance to imperialism within our own communities?
This webinar, hey. Like organizing political education spaces to develop people's consciousness of what's happening in the world, to help them understand the connections between what they see in their communities, the issues they can clearly identify, and what's happening all over this planet. Like, a lot of work is put into making people in the US believe that so-called domestic issues have nothing to do with international issues, and we got to focus on the domestic, and international we'll do it if we have time. That's not true. It has never been true. Like I mentioned in my presentation, the cops that are beating us at protests who are occupying our communities are trained by the IDF in Israel. So we have to help people understand the direct connection between the global and the domestic. We have to have political education spaces like this, not just virtually, but in person, where our people are. Like here in Orlando, the APRP organized with an organization known as Real Orlando, what we called an Edu Forum on Niger and Haiti and on domestic police violence. And we were literally just like drawing the connection for people. And it was clear, like the real situation is that most folks don't know what's happening. If they understood what was really happening in Palestine, what was really happening in Haiti, what was really happening in Cuba, they would oppose US imperialism. But a lot of time and energy and resources are invested in keeping people confused and in the dark. And we, as revolutionaries, as organizers, as people fighting for social justice, have a responsibility to help them understand what's happening, to develop their consciousness, to develop their critical thinking skills so they can understand what the system is, how it works, and our responsibility to oppose it and our capacity to oppose it. The other thing that's really, really important is being active in political organizations, fighting for justice, whether it's like a mutual aid collective or a socialist political party or what have you, like some kind of collective of people working together. And then within the context of that organization, taking organized action to raise resources and give them to the resistance. Like in the APRP, that is a huge focus of our work. In the worldwide Pan-African movement, that is a huge focus of our work. We have more resources in the West. We raise resources in the West and we send them to our chapters in Africa, like direct material support to resistance struggles. In the Cuba Solidarity Movement, it's very, very, very similar. When the Trump administration applied maximum pressure sanctions on Cuba in the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, the US-Cuba Solidarity Movement literally gathered thousands and thousands and thousands of syringes to send to Cuba so they could put vaccines into the arms of their citizens. That kind of work is happening in political organizations throughout the US. So these responsibilities of engaging in political education, of engaging in material solidarity, happen best in the context of political organizations. So if you're not in an organization, join an organization and then start educating your community, start engaging in discussions about these issues, and start raising resources and transferring them to national liberation struggles, anti-imperialist struggles around the world.
Just one quick thing to add to that. It's as we saw in 2020 with the George Floyd uprisings, as we're seeing now, we're really good at mobilizing, right? We're really good at putting people out in the street. We're really good at showing up in moments of outrage and reacting to these, these flagrant instances of murder of our Black relatives or Palestinian relatives. Like, we're really good at doing that. But the forces, we have to ask ourselves, Where is the organizations that we have, to sustain? And a lot of them have been destroyed, by attacks by, the state, through surveillance. Some people talk about like COINTELPRO, like it's this kind of like crazy conspiracy thing. And it happened to the Black movement, happened to the Native movement. It continued on into the 80s, with CISPES, with the El Salvadorian revolutionaries. Like it didn't end, right? Leonard Peltier is in prison. He's served 8 life sentences so far. For what? For having the dream of freedom, right? But one of the things that they've attempted to do, and I don't think they've been quite successful, in completely annihilating this long tradition of resistance. But we need to go beyond just mobilizing. We're really great at mobilizing, but it's when we get organized and understand that this is a long-term struggle that we have to dedicate our lives to, that we may not, hopefully I want to see liberation in my lifetime, but we have to realize that somebody sacrificed, somebody sat in a jail cell, somebody gave their life so I could be here talking today, right? And to remember that that was a long-term commitment. So we have to be good ancestors to future generations, right? By making sure that we are creating the infrastructure that's necessary to carry this forward, to provide resources, as Onye said, to people who need it when we have that surplus, when we have access to that surplus, right? But also those resources, aren't just sort of like money and, tangible things. It's also for us in the imperial core, in the belly of the beast. It's about raising the consciousness, that of our own people, and building organizations that are going to sustain themselves, so that we can yes, we can continue to mobilize, but we're also having organized sort of articulations of what those demands are.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you so much, Anye. Unfortunately, everyone, we have to end it there. We've run out of time. You can find Anye with the AAPRP and Hood Communists there. You can find Nick Estes with the Red Nation, Red Media. We will be having, again, our series. Our next episode will be next Tuesday at 7 p.m., where we will be talking and historicizing the Islamic resistance in Gaza. Please join us then. I want to thank everyone again for your questions, for your participation. We hope to see you next week. And I think one thing I would like to end it with is just restating what our purpose for the series is. Honestly, it just started with a need, recognizing a need that we needed a space to reflect, to raise a political consciousness, to recognize the stage of where our movement is at, and how we can build a sustainable movement for Palestine here at home. So thank you so much, and we hope to see everyone next week. Bye, guys.